final week, we will be examining military, war, and terrorism. Our primary objective for this week is to examine the contemporary reality of race, class, and gender in U.S. military. And while the text does discuss the theories at length, and you will be asked to apply some of those in the discussion question, I am going to spend the majority of this lecture discussing the composition of the military at present, as well as the history. And then we'll conclude this unit by examining some of the possibilities for a more inclusive future of the military. The U.S. military is comprised of these 5 branches of the armed force. The Department of Defense is charged with coordinating functions associated with national defense and the U.S. Armed Forces. It is the largest employer in the world, and as you might expect, the United States also spends a considerable amount of money on the military. A significant portion of our budget goes to the military. Upon examination of the composition of the military, what has been found is that although military recruits come from throughout the United States, there is a significant percentage that come from the southern region of the country. So you might consider why this is the case. Why do we have nearly half of our recruits coming from our southern states? It's also important to recognize that the largest proportion of armed force recruits come from middle-class communities as well as working-class communities. And although the armed forces have removed a lot of the barriers that prevented women from serving in all aspects of the military, women nonetheless comprise a minority of the armed forces. In 2016, it was 15% and has increased slightly. But of course, as you are all aware, one of the problems that the military has faced and continues to face is sexual harassment and abuse of its female recruits, and often by the male recruits in the military. And as we've seen, not just the enlisted men, but officers as well. Minorities have comprised an increasing percentage of the military recruits. Minorities are overrepresented in the percentage in the military. In 2014, minorities made up 23.4% of the United States population between the ages of 18 and 44, but that same year they comprised nearly 33% of all enlisted personnel. So again, I asked students in the discussion questions to consider why Black, Indigenous people of color, or minorities as they're referred to in your textbook, why they are overrepresented in the military. What is it about the military that may attract Black, Indigenous people of color to enlist? And why does the military often recruit heavily in low-income areas or in communities of color? The textbook provides students with a theoretical analysis of the military. And as has been true in previous chapters, the functionalist theory is applied, the symbolic interactionist theory is applied, and then the monopoly or the materialistic perspective is applied. By applying all 3 theories, students are able to develop a more comprehensive understanding of the military through the sociological lens. I'm not going to spend time really going in detail over these theories because students will have an opportunity to develop their ideas on these theories in the discussions. What I would like to do is spend the remainder of this brief recording just briefly providing students with an overview of the wars which have taken place in the United States and how race and gender have played a role in these wars, and also how these wars have actually shaped the environment in which Black, Indigenous people of color reside and how they interact in the United States. So this particular quote here is important. Every war shapes new traditions and creates new social norms. So as you are reviewing the wars that are discussed in our textbook, consider how these wars are shaping new social norms, and particularly how these social norms affect Black, Indigenous people of color. The first war is the Revolutionary War, and what we have found in every war is that Black men and women have played a role in these wars, and often a significant role. The role of particularly Black men in the military has really been underappreciated, and many individuals often are led to believe that the wars, particularly the wars before Vietnam, were primarily fought by white soldiers, and this really wasn't the case. The wars with Native Americans to acquire their land really changed the landscape, particularly for Native Americans, because these wars often resulted in them being removed from their homes, and if they did not die in these wars, then those who survived were often relocated to other areas. So what we found in these wars, or with these wars, is that Native Americans often lost not only their homelands, but often a considerable amount of power in shaping their own futures. And of course, this is one of the wars which took place in Florida, and after this war ended, what we saw was that those individuals who survived were moved westward, and many of these individuals ended up residing on reservations in Oklahoma. The Civil War, of course, is the war which ended slavery, brought an end to slavery, and it was often assumed that individuals in the North were the individuals who really wanted to bring about freedom to the enslaved individuals, and that it was really those individuals who resided in the South, or the Confederates, who were those individuals who chose to continue this history of enslaving Africans. However, while it is true that the North wanted an end to slavery, it's important for students to recognize that this does not mean that white Northerners saw African slaves as equal. And even after the war ended, not only did Black men and women continue to experience discrimination in the South, but that discrimination also existed in the North. The Congressional Medal of Honor is the highest military honor for combat heroism. And what we have seen is that those individuals of color who have received, Black, Indigenous people of color who have received this medal, are few, and often it's done posthumously, so after they have died. And up until recently, there hadn't been any medals of honor that had been awarded to Black Americans who had fought in World War II, and there were a significant number of Black Americans who fought in World War II, despite the fact that they began this fight in segregated militaries, because the desegregation did not occur until the last part of the 1940s, 1948, despite the fact that they were in segregated units and often were the target of discrimination by civilians as well as white soldiers, they still fought for freedom that they didn't necessarily enjoy after the war ended. Vietnam War was the first war in which black men participated in significant numbers. This was when we saw an increase. And once again, individuals joined the military many times to find a path to a better life, but often to escape the discrimination that was occurring in the United States in the 1950s and in the 1960s. Although upon returning, they found that they continued to experience discrimination and have many obstacles to trying to achieve social mobility. And after Vietnam, it seemed we had a few decades of what some individuals would call a peaceful period, although we did have the Cold War in the 1980s. But beginning in the 1990s, and particularly after 9/11, we've begun to fight, quote, the wars on terrorism. And this have been referred to many as global wars on terrorism, and others have referred to them as the never-ending wars. They have lasted several decades now, 2 decades, and have often been criticized because for some individuals, they do not believe significant progress has been made. And as you're all aware, the United States will be withdrawing the majority of their troops from Afghanistan. And for those individuals who fought in Afghanistan, who had their friends die in Afghanistan, who may have become disabled in Afghanistan, trying to save a particular town or take a particular hill, the fact that once the U.S. leaves, in all likelihood, those forces that they fought against will retake those villages. Because the wars on terrorism have been such a long war, as you might expect, the United States has spent a considerable amount of money on fighting terrorism. Your book indicates that in 2015, I believe, 2016, when this research was being done, there had been over $2 trillion that had been spent on these wars. However, the latest estimates tell us that we have now spent over $6 trillion on these wars. And that is one of the reasons that many Americans are eager to have an end to these wars, because of the amount of money that is being spent in a war that some individuals don't believe we are winning. So what is the purpose of these continued wars throughout the history of the United States? Well, one of the primary objectives in theory, one of the goals, is to prevent tyranny. Wars are entered because it is believed that either in the past in what is now the United States, or at present in other countries, that we are helping individuals gain freedom. But it's really difficult to think of a time when we were completely free of any type of conflict, and for many individuals it's difficult to think of a time when we will ever be free of conflict. So therefore, one of the objectives is to develop a more sane, reasonable, and just way of avoiding inequitable structures and practices that often reflect race, class, and gender, and that lead to these wars, whether they happen to be in the United States. We haven't, of course, had a war in the United States for a long time since the Civil War, but nonetheless, what we tend to find is that if there's equity in the United States or in other countries, that it might be a significant deterrent to terrorism, and particularly domestic terrorism, which unfortunately, as you're all aware, we are now in the views of many politicians. We are at risk to increased risk to domestic terrorism. So in conclusion, our military institutions in theory hold the key to effectively and efficiently using our human resources if we can use them in a manner that encourages individuals and cities to serve, participate, and provide oversight to the military so that they can more effectively help the military serve the citizens of our country in a way that will produce more equitable results. So this week I'm asking students to consider some of the key issues which are raised in our textbook and in the discussion, and think about applying a sociological lens to understanding the military in the United States, as well as considering the role that race, gender, and class play in the military.